For 71 years, this airline connected New York to Paris, Rome, and Cairo, at a time when very few American carriers dared to fly that far. It survived the Great Depression. It survived being owned by one of the strangest, most reclusive billionaires in American history. It survived World War II and came out the other side as one of just 3 dominant U.S. airlines, alongside United and American. What it didn't survive was one specific man, buying it in 1988 with a plan that had almost nothing to do with actually running an airline. By the time Trans World Airlines finally disappeared in 2001, absorbed into the same rival it had competed against for 70 years, it had filed for bankruptcy 3 separate times and lost the very asset that once made it special in the first place. This is the story of TWA. Welcome back to Boardroom Ruins, where we dig into the companies that built entire industries and then watched those industries move on without them. If you've been here before, you know how this goes. No fluff, no filler, just the real decisions, the real numbers, and the real moments where it all started to come apart. If you're new, consider this your warning. Once you start seeing how these collapses actually happen, you start noticing the same patterns everywhere. Hit subscribe now because you're going to want to see the next one. All right, back to the story.
TWA's roots trace back to July 16, 1930, when several smaller carriers, Transcontinental Air Transport, Western Air Express, and a handful of others, merged to form Transcontinental and Western Air, flying a single coast-to-coast route between New York and Los Angeles, with stops in St. Louis and Kansas City along the way. The airline changed its name to Trans World Airlines in 1950, by which point it had already built a reputation as one of the boldest, most ambitious carriers in American aviation. In 1939, the airline came under the control of one of its most famous and strangest owners, the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. Hughes held TWA for 27 years, and despite his own increasing personal reclusiveness, he's widely credited with pushing the airline's international expansion deep into Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, routes that would define TWA's identity for decades afterward. Through the 1950s and 60s, TWA became one of the 3 dominant forces in American commercial aviation, alongside United and American Airlines. Its transatlantic routes, New York to Paris, to Rome, to Cairo, to Tel Aviv, became genuinely iconic, carrying a certain glamour that budget domestic routes never quite matched. Even under Hughes' ownership, though, TWA faced a persistent structural problem. Banks were reluctant to lend to the airline while the increasingly reclusive Hughes remained at the helm, given his erratic personal behavior and unwillingness to engage directly with the company's own finances. By 1960, with TWA facing a real risk of bankruptcy, Hughes was ultimately forced to relinquish control. The airline continued operating successfully for years afterward, eventually reorganizing in 1979 under a new parent, Trans World Corporation, before Trans World sold TWA back to the public in 1984, partly as a defense against a threatened hostile takeover. That defense didn't work for long. In late 1985, the American investor Carl Icahn acquired the airline. Icahn had by this point already built a well-known reputation for buying struggling companies and extracting value from them, not always in ways that left the underlying business healthier. In 1986, under Icahn acquired Ozark Airlines, a carrier with routes centered on the south-central United States, strengthening TWA's hub position in St. Louis. Then, in 1988, Icahn took the entire airline private in a leveraged buyout, personally receiving $469 million from the deal, while saddling TWA itself with $540 million in new debt. It became more and more apparent that Carl was not interested in growing the airline, former TWA pilot Jeff Darnall later told St. Louis Magazine, but in using TWA as a financial vehicle to acquire wealth for himself. In 1991, Icahn made a decision that many longtime TWA employees and industry observers still point to as the moment the airline's fate was effectively sealed. He sold TWA's coveted London Heathrow landing slots, among the most valuable and hard-to-obtain assets in international commercial aviation, to American Airlines for $445 million. Heathrow slots aren't easily replaced once given up. They're a scarce, tightly regulated resource, and TWA's international identity had been built substantially around exactly this kind of premium access. Some analysts believe this single sale accelerated TWA's decline more than any other decision Icahn made. The airline that had once defined transatlantic glamour had just voluntarily handed one of its most prized assets directly to its biggest domestic rival. By January 1992, the accumulated debt and eroding asset base caught up with the company. TWA filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, though it continued operating throughout the reorganization process. TWA emerged from that first bankruptcy in 1993, with 55% of the company now owned by its creditors. Icahn himself, as a major creditor, owed $190 million, negotiated an unusual arrangement on his way out, an 8-year agreement letting him purchase select tickets at 55% of their normal cost. He then resold many of those discounted tickets, reportedly through early internet ticket resale channels. American Airlines later estimated this single arrangement cost TWA close to $100 million a year in lost revenue, Icahn continuing to extract value from the airline for years after he technically walked away from running it. TWA filed for bankruptcy a second time in 1995, still struggling under the weight of its accumulated debt and shrinking market position. Then, on July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800, en route from New York to Paris, exploded shortly after takeoff, killing all 230 people on board. It remains the third deadliest aviation accident in United States history. Beyond the immense human loss, the disaster inflicted lasting damage on public confidence in the airline, at a moment when TWA had little financial cushion left to absorb it. The airline continued operating through the remainder of the 1990s, working to stabilize its finances and rebuild its battered reputation. But the structural damage from years of extraction under Icahn's ownership, combined with the tragedy of Flight 800, left the company in a persistently fragile position.
By July 2000, as TWA marked its 75th anniversary, the financial markets had largely lost confidence in the airline's ability to continue independently. In January 2001, TWA filed for its third and final bankruptcy, this time alongside an agreement to sell nearly all of its assets to American Airlines, the same carrier that had received TWA's Heathrow slots a decade earlier. The timing compounded an already difficult transition. The September 11th attacks occurred later that same year, prompting American Airlines to lay off many former TWA employees during an already brutal period for the entire airline industry. TWA technically continued to exist as a legal entity under American Airlines until July 1, 2003, before being formally dissolved. American closed TWA's longtime St. Louis hub entirely in 2009. So what actually happened to TWA? Unlike a lot of the companies we cover, TWA's core product was never really the problem. Its international routes, at their peak, were genuinely respected and valued. What ultimately ended TWA was a decade of ownership decisions that treated the airline less like a business to grow and more like an asset to be stripped for value. A leveraged buyout that loaded it with debt, the sale of its most valuable international landing slots to its biggest rival, and a post-bankruptcy ticket arrangement that kept draining revenue for years afterward. Add in the devastating loss of Flight 800 at a moment when the company had little financial resilience left, and TWA faced blow after blow it simply never had the underlying strength to absorb. There's a genuinely sobering thought sitting at the center of TWA's story. Sometimes a great airline, or a great company of any kind, doesn't get destroyed by a competitor, or even really by the market. Sometimes it gets destroyed slowly, deliberately, by the very ownership that was supposed to be protecting it. If you found this one interesting, we've covered other companies that survived everything the market threw at them and still couldn't survive their own leadership. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.